This week on the Capitol Cable, installment 128, the National Defense Strategy of the Trump Administration. With us, Karlin, Lubold, Seiler, no Cha. All that and more next on the Capitol Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in Washington, D.C. Good evening to those of you in South Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 128th installment of the CSIS Capitol Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capitol Cable, the National Defense Strategy of the Trump Administration. And with us, three outstanding guests, All-Star Hall of Fame panel. I'm going to go Hall of Fame today with us to discuss this issue and kick it around, machinate, analyze, assess, all that good stuff. Three, again, all-star panelists. First, in no particular order, but she is fantastic. First, Dr. Mara Karlin. I'm going to welcome them in one by one. Currently a professor of practice at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. Prior to that, service in government as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy as well. She also served in the Obama administration. The prior two positions were in the Biden administration. Sorry about that. Prior service in the Obama administration as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, and as in and out of academia, back at SAIS, Brookings, a congressional study group on Syria, and 2 books on military history to her name. Dr. Karlin, Mara, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, outstanding. All right, next, a more familiar face to the Capitol Cable, Mr. Gordon Lubold, rather. Apologies for that. NBC National Security Correspondent. Prior to that, 20 plus years covering national security issues as a journalist, including the Wall Street Journal, including launching, I believe, 3 different publications, including the very famous Foreign Policy Situation Report, when he worked in and around the halls of the Pentagon. And of course, he was also a visiting fellow for a time at the United States Institute of Peace and an avid CrossFit junkie, so he would fit right in with the Hegseth Pentagon. Gordon, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
All right. Do you think you're up to the workouts, or what do you think? Are you
there? I don't know. Actually, there's some debate on that. We can offline on that.
All right, excellent. Okay, so you probably you'd at least get a shot to make the qualification. Like you'd have a fighting chance. You wouldn't get
Yeah, maybe I get like an initial look, but okay. I don't know. We'll see.
All right, outstanding. Okay, here we go. Last but not least, of course, CSIS's own Sid Seiler. Everybody knows Sid. Nearly 4 decades in the U.S. government in a range of different roles, including the intelligence community, State Department, at the United States Forces Korea Command. Sid's done it all: diplomatic, intelligence, and of course, policy roles at the NSC. Oh, I was remiss, the CIA as well. So, Sid, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Looking forward to it.
All right. What did I miss in your bio here? Anything?
I think
did I get it all? All right. Excellent. I usually do your bio by looking at the background and then sort of trying to reverse engineer the bio. So there you go.
That's good.
All right. Outstanding. All right. With that, I would say Victor dropped off at the last minute. He's traveling in Asia, flight issue, promoting his new book, by the way. Take a look at the book. Really well done. Good stuff there. Andy Lim, our intrepid executive producer, I guess that's for lack of a better term, is also a co-author of the book. So if you have anything to do, if you're interested in China, weaponization, all that good stuff, check out the new book by Victor, Ellen, and Andy. All right, book plug over. Let's get into it, as they say. First, deadly serious topic, really interesting stuff here, too, to unpack. What we're here to do today mainly is talk about the National Defense Strategy and its implications for Asia. And of course, this being a Korea program, we're going to dive deep on Korea implications as well. But first up, Dr. Karlin, who's got a ton of experience in and around this issue. Her background is as a strategist. And so let's just go to you, Mara, first. Broad strokes, can you walk us through your major conclusions about the 2026 NDS? How does it differ from the Biden approach? What's interesting to you? Again, Mara, welcome to the show, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much. So this NDS dropped on a website on a Friday night recently. There was no sort of splashy rollout, which in and of itself is pretty interesting. And usually a defense strategy is like a decoder ring. It tells you, here's the secretary's vision, here's kind of where the activities of the department will be, here's where the resources are going to be, kind of who the winners and the losers will be of major decisions. And this 2026 one's pretty interesting in a couple ways. First of all, it's written in a rather partisan way, which is not quite what usually happens. The department is, of course, a technocratic, really professional type of environment. And this one's pretty different in that regard. It's pretty vicious toward its predecessors. But let's turn to the substance. So the substance, first of all, the top priority is migrants and narcos. The priority region is the Western Hemisphere. Now, if you read the National Security Strategy, that all tracks, sounds exactly right. What's a little different is they do throw in the Indo-Pacific as another priority, but it's a much narrower focus on the Indo-Pacific. And what I found particularly striking is it's just a lot weaker on China than either the Biden strategy or even the Trump one. In 2018, the Trump strategy said we're most worried about two things, Russia and China. In 2022, the Biden strategy said we have one priority, the threat posed by China. Now it's really lesser order. And what I'm going to be watching for is how they try to manifest this when it's not a priority for the White House whatsoever. And when the key ways in which the Department of Defense would try to show that it's concerned about China would be things like building a more capable military, increasing posture in the region, being more capable and operational with allies and partners. And at least a couple of those seem pretty unclear right now.
All right, outstanding. Excellent laydown. Let me dive a little bit deeper on this China point. It is really interesting, right? And maybe just to read some of the language back to you that I found to be most operative, and maybe I misread it, with apologies to the Pentagon if I'm misreading their points of emphasis, but it says our goal is not to dominate China, not to strangle or humiliate them. Rather, it's to prevent anyone, including China, from being able to dominate us or our allies. In essence, to set the military conditions required to achieve the NSS goal of a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that allows all of us to enjoy a decent peace. But what do you make? You alluded to it earlier in your intervention, but what do you make of this language and or goal that they've set out here? And how would you see this being operationalized in the Pentagon? Mara, back to you.
Yeah, the way I understood that language is that there are some who care about China in the Pentagon, but it's not ubiquitous. And this is not a view held by the White House. And I say that because the national security strategy is so focused on China as an economic challenge and almost entirely ignores the security picture. You know, what was fascinating during the 2022 national defense strategy when I ran it in the Biden administration was the just extraordinary agreement across the board that the top priority had to be focusing on China, that there was kind of no other country in the world that was able, was willing and increasingly able to fundamentally reshape the global security order. So look, I think some in the Pentagon are still do still believe that, but it's not a ubiquitous view, and it's not held by the White House. And look, as we have all seen in our careers, when there's a difference in opinion between the Pentagon and the White House, there's usually no question about who ends up prevailing in that. So, sorry, please.
No. I was just going to say, I was chief of staff at the Pentagon, and I always won. So, so anyway.
No doubt.
Right.
There are exceptions, but usually, like, the president, understandably, as the commander-in-chief, is going to prevail. So what does the operationalization of this mean? It may seem funny to say when you're talking about a budget of like $900 billion and 3.5 million people in the Pentagon, but there really are finite resources. There's finite sort of time and attention for folks as well. And when we look at what the military has done over the last year of the Trump administration, I have to assume that what we will see is a pretty big continuation there. It has not focused on the Indo-Pacific. It's frankly done a lot to push away some of our closest allies there. Our posture there has actually gone down as assets and platforms have flowed to other regions, particularly the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere. So if you're trying to figure out how are you going to choose winners and losers in really hard circumstances, this strategy is fundamentally not going to get you to focusing on the Indo-Pacific. So I expect our posture will continue to go down. I expect that our interconnectedness with allies and partners in the region will probably not be prioritized either. And I have to wonder if you're sitting in Beijing, if you don't notice that Taiwan is mentioned exactly 0 times in this strategy, and you're probably perhaps thinking maybe I should just kind of smile, be quiet, and bide my time, since this just does not appear to be a major area of focus.
All right, outstanding. Last question to you, last follow-up, and then I'm going to come to Gordon. Let's put the allies and partners conversation off for a bit, but let me just pull on one thread here. The other, I wouldn't say omission, there's a bit of a treatment of it, is this notion that was, I think, very dominant in the Biden administration about getting to the commanding heights on several key technologies, right? Now, there's a big treatment of the defense industrial base in the strategy. There's a little bit of mention of AI, and there's a sentence or two on the importance of new technologies. But in your winners and losers assessment here, what do you make of the investment strategy that comes out? And will that investment strategy have implications for our ability to compete or outposition China in the Indo-Pacific? Full stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 2 pieces to this. So one, when you read through the strategy carefully, there's a couple areas you see in which you would know where your money's going to be put. Missile defense is a pretty obvious one. Nukes is another. Cyber is as well. I think those all kind of make a lot of sense, and frankly, any administration is gonna be able to do that. Here's the second piece that's pretty interesting. If you were building a military who's focused on threats posed by migrants and narcos in the Western Hemisphere, you actually build a very different military than if you're worried about fighting away games, projecting power, high-end conventional conflict. So there's actually going to be this real division outside of the key elements that I highlighted, where, for example, if you're most focused on the Western Hemisphere and on these alleged threats posed by migrants and narcos, right, you're building a bunch of surface ships. That's where you're putting a lot of money in. If you're thinking about possible conflicts in the Indo-Pacific, you don't want a lot of surface ships. You want a lot of submarines to just kind of hone in on the Navy. So I think there'll be a real tension as the department tries to figure out how it tries to operationalize this these real different approaches.
All right, interesting stuff. And it's not inconsistent to have surface ships rev up, for lack of a better term, the manufacturing base. But that manufacturing looks a lot different if you're going after the high-end technologies too, to play in the away game, as you put it. All right, outstanding, Mara. Gordon, you've been on the sidelines too long. I hope you haven't cooled down completely from the CrossFit workout here. Okay. But the question to you is, you covered this administration. You've covered multiple administrations, and there's always players, policies, politics driving these strategies. Can you give me your take on the drivers of this strategy and your overall assessment?
Yeah, sure. This is so interesting. I think Mara's point, she made a bunch of excellent points. One of them being that it was kind of, pushed out on a Friday afternoon when reporters like us had to scramble. In this case, it was my colleagues scramble to kind of write up a piece about the NDS, which is normally a pretty big, I shouldn't say too big of a deal, but it's an important strategy document, obviously. And the fact that it was just kind of quietly rolled out, no fanfare, no briefings, of course, because the Pentagon doesn't do that really anymore. does say something about this document. I think that on the politics side of it, and this is not a political statement, but a document such as this, I don't know how enduring it will be even for the next 3 or 4 years. The writers of it, and we can talk about the kind of drivers in a second, but like any document within any strategy document within Trump administration has to leave wiggle room for a president who tends to go off script, right? Go off script at speeches, go off script in his own kind of policy pronouncements. It could change from one day to the next. And again, not a political statement there. We know that about this president. And so, and we can't forget that this document rolled out, a few months before the president's expected to visit President Xi. And, I think although President Trump likes to, talk with swagger and sometimes, very strong language about adversaries, I think going into this meeting, he wants to level set in a way to potentially leverage as much as he can from this meeting and from the relationship that he's trying to build or maybe reset even with China. But I think that some of the stuff that it says, I hate to say it, but probably doesn't mean a lot, because the only thing that means anything is what the president says, and even that sometimes doesn't amount to a lot. Obviously, there's this focus on the Western Hemisphere. I think the senior policy people at the Pentagon may feel a little bit differently about how they want to characterize the threat from China. I think it's fascinating that Taiwan is not mentioned. But I think that they can thread the needle by saying we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, but we are also going to, address Chinese issues of any threat from China through issues, Panama Canal. We saw early on in the administration concern about China there, concern obviously about adversaries such as China when it came to Greenland, which was last month's kind of drama. So I think that they can kind of thread the needle with a document that I don't think we honestly can read too much into, given the president's proclivity for for kind of changing his mind and kind of wiggling around. Now, it is interesting that it was written and devised by people we assumed were going into the Pentagon with a certain kind of view about that region. I think Rich Colby's a pragmatic person and kind of recognizes that he, has to thread this needle. I was talking to somebody last night who was re-emphasizing the pragmatism of the people inside the Pentagon, to include Pete Hegseth, but really people like Bridge, who are China hawks typically. He might argue differently if he was on the show today. But I mean, and although there are these threats of kind of reductions in different places, we talk about South Korea and other places, I wonder how much substantial cuts could really come, because I think in the end, there's not going to be these huge, you're not shifting the aircraft carrier to a completely, 180 degrees in any way. And so I just kind of, I guess my biggest takeaway is this is a nice marker, but I don't know in the end, in say 2 or 3 years, if it's going to have represented a huge shift.
Gotcha. No, very interesting points. In other words, that it's an interesting framework, but even the framework could be modified given where the president, or given the president's proclivities to be somewhat impulsive and shoot from the hip, right, from time to time. All right, so let me ask you one other follow-up here then. You alluded to it a bit in your intervention. the reaction from what I would call the national security community, just take it quickly in maybe 2 or 3 buckets. The uniformed military at the Pentagon, which you alluded to, the Congress, where you still have, especially in the Senate, a fair amount of Republican hawks, right? Traditional internationalist Republicans, and the House too. You've got the China Select Committee over there as well. That was, I would say, very hard line's probably too pejorative, but a very, I would say, assertive, right, in this space. And then obviously I guess you would say the policy community in and around Washington. What's the reaction been to this? Has it been, well, this is just giving, Trump enough space and flexibility, and in the end, he's the decision maker, and this will go forward? Or is this a document that is going to have lasting impacts and ripple effects on the Pentagon's procurement policy, positioning, all of that? Gordon, the floor is yours.
I mean, the procurement issue is an interesting one on the U.S. side and the Chinese industrial base side, but we can talk about it. But, I think my guess, and Barry's talking to people, but also just kind of my gut is that this is, even from the Hill and the China Hawks or whatever, they understand that, again, the pragmatism of seeing China through this Western Hemisphere lens and trying to accept that they can, I think the wording somehow was, whether it was the NSS or the NDS, a bit like the focus is on the Western Hemisphere, but outside of the Western Hemisphere, China is a concern or whatever. But it was, I wrote it down, they made a point of the just non-confrontation. I think that there's a general acceptance, and I don't want to keep leaning on my kind of initial theory that the document probably doesn't mean much, but I feel like it's relevant because I think that even Republicans accept, okay, we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, but we're going to worry about China through that lens and still retain all of our kind of positions on what we should do, vis-a-vis that region. And so I just would be surprised if there, like, they could reduce some capabilities in some of these places that we are concerned about, but I don't know that it's going to be as stark as we might think, and then therefore then acceptable to the Hawks who would be concerned about it.
Got it. All right, Mario wants to come in, then over to Sid.
Yeah, I totally agree with Gordon's point about the open question of whether or not this thing gets implemented, because it is not at all clear who owns this document. I mean, dropping it Friday night and then not having done any sort of rollout, usually you're having like umpteen engagements on the Hill. When we release the strategies I've worked on over the years, you bring every defense attaché in Washington to the Pentagon so you can talk them through it on the day of release. I mean, you're doing TV, you're just doing all of the things, particularly at a very senior level. And there's just no evidence that anyone senior in the Pentagon is actually going to own it. I guess the other piece that strikes me from what Gordon's saying is maybe the document's too cute. And if it's a little too cute and trying to say, well, we're offering this priority because we're told to, but we don't really like this one, I mean, fundamentally, that's just not going to become a reality then.
Gotcha. It sounds like me at the Golden Corral buffet. But anyway, I really want the chocolate fountain, but, I know I should have some salad. All right, outstanding. No, really, really, really good crosstalk back and forth there. All right, Sid, over to you. And Sid, obviously come in on any of these points that you want to, but I really want to start shifting, because we're got about 20 minutes left, into allies, partners, Asia, that discussion line, because I think I'm wondering what they're wondering, basically, in terms of how they're interpreting this with the NSS together as a complement. All right, Sid, the floor is yours.
Well, Mark, there's so much familiarity to these two documents, the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, in that as an Asia guy who's focused on North Korea, what have we been struggling with for the past 15 to 20 years? It's figuring out what is the threat posed by China and how do we block the threat posed by North Korea. And I think in both capitals, you've had a pursuit of increased capabilities to counter U.S. What they see as U.S. dominance in the region, but at a pace not so severe that it it generates a concentrated response. So we continue to ask, when are we pivoting to Asia? The truth is, the Middle East continues to dominate our attention because there's hot wars going on there in Asia. We came in with Donald Trump came in 2027, that's a year of unification with Taiwan. And we started to hear that less and less as we focus more and more on economic things. And for me, about halfway through the year last year, I thought to myself, this is a president who might take it softer on the military security side vis-a-vis China while pursuing these economic objectives and waiting until at least that magical summit that's going to take place in a few months to explore what's possible with China. And so don't talk about Taiwan. Why put something on the table that would only irritate the situation? And I think that kind of explains the language here on North Korea and on the alliances in terms of the North Korea threat. It acknowledges there's a North Korea threat. Interestingly, in Elbridge Colby's subsequent speech at a Sejong Institute in Seoul, not a lot on the threat posed by North Korea. It seems like this administration is wanting to make sure it doesn't look like some type of conflict with North Korea or even with China is inevitable. And therefore, as we talked about before the fact, if you ask your average American, the supporter of Donald Trump, which says, what's your worry that in the middle of the night an ICBM is going to fall in your backyard, or that narco traffickers are going to sell a relative an opiate that ODs them, right? President's focused on these issues that appeal to his base and not to the national security establishment, who looks at these documents and scratches their head. That said, as Gordon and Mara both pointed out, I don't know that there are major decisions that would take place within the context of either document that would significantly change or undermine the alliance. But I know you'll have some questions on that, particularly on South Korea's the demand that South Korea take more responsibility for its own defense.
All right. Well, you already know the test, Sid. So why don't you answer the question? So let me just frame it then quickly. First, on DPRK, what's interesting to me is that, yes, there does seem to be a lack of emphasis, but the language, with apologies to Tom Clancy, clear and present danger, is quite strong. And clear and present danger to the homeland, which, as Mara and Gordon both outlined, is the number one priority, right? Which is interesting. And so maybe that's a missile defense solve versus a allies and troops on the peninsula solve. Anyway, so your thoughts there. And then quickly, what does Pyongyang make of this document? And then I'm going to get it around for reactions from Mara and Gordon on possible allied discussions.
So here are some rough numbers. The United States has 28,500 troops. It goes up and down by 1,000 or so, depending on troop deployments for exercises, et cetera. But that's 28,500 troops. And our largest base overseas, Camp Humphreys, we're in the Republic of Korea in significant numbers, but not in numbers that compete with South Korea active duty, 500,000, 3.1 million in reserve. And of course, the North Korea threat of 1+ million Korean People's Army. This is not a battle that in its opening days is primarily one that has a large U.S. involvement. So the idea that South Korea needs to take more responsibility for its defense South Korea already is taking a large portion of that responsibility. And the things that we bring to the game, missile defense, intelligence surveillance radar, Navy assets, and of course, behind all that, the extended deterrent. An extended deterrent that applies not only to deterring North Korea's nuclear program, but North Korea's aggression writ large. So I appreciate the national defense strategy. I think it's very straightforward in its language in capturing the threat, noting that it's a large army from North Korea, but it's antiquated, it's got some weaknesses. That North Korea's behavior demonstrate that it's willing to misbehave and use force to achieve national objectives in a way that puts U.S. lives at risk. That's all very good, and I think this it provides a framework for the discussion that the U.S. and ROK were going to have anyway on one of the E.J. Myung administration's priorities of transfer of wartime operational control by the end of President Lee's term or whatever year is set, which implies South Korea taking a larger role for itself, not abandoning some degree of dependency on the U.S. as an ally in the capabilities we bring, but certainly demonstrating that South Korea is a sovereign country with capabilities to take care of itself. So it's a direction that we were already heading. So there's nothing particularly, unless you're a hardline conservative South Korean who fears any change to the U.S. posture might encourage Kim Jong-un to take advantage of. It's not that bad a document. From North Korea's perspective, again, I think there's enough in the national defense strategy to show that the U.S. has not dismissed the North Korea threat, either to its ally partners whom we have commitments or to the homeland with its ICBMs. And we will continue to deal with the North Korean threat, even though we don't act as though it's some type of invasion from North Korea is likely to occur in the next week, month, or even few years. So deterrence is maintained. A lot of ambiguities, a lot of questions. You could argue those are flexibilities. As events unfold, other contingencies come up where our attention naturally will have to go to maybe it's Iran next or what have you. But for now, both China and North Korea are somewhat deterred, and there's no reason to believe that would be significantly weakened by these documents themselves.
All right, outstanding. Thanks. So just maybe I'm going to just make a quick comment here. Just a reminder, and tell me if my memory serves, the other point in your South Koreans defending the peninsula is that they have day-to-day responsibility for defense of the peninsula, right? And they've had that since the late 70s, and only when the defense condition goes to a certain level does the Combined Forces Command take over and the U.S. general, or if you change that, the South Korean general take over, right? And so principally, this is about a massive conflagration and likely managing a force flow, right? So I think that's an interesting point that's often lost in there. The other point that I would say in terms of the U.S. that I don't think will change is the role of air power, right, in and around the peninsula and any conflict there. All right, so over to Mara. Mara, to you, I see your AUKUS cup there, right? So reaction from the allies, Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, and others on this document here. What are they thinking, their reactions, implications?
Absolutely. And I would just note something that Sid was just talking about first, which is folks may feel comfortable with how the North Korea threat is highlighted in the NDS. It's also mentioned 0 times in the national security strategy. And I realize this is all a little bit wonky, but I've found that these documents get inhaled in capitals. I mean, they are read word for word, et cetera. And so I don't know that one should have that much confidence in the sort of the lesser one highlighted. So how are kind of capitals trying to understand this? And yes, I did serendipitously bring my awesome AUKUS mug, if you can see it through the Zoom. Look, so the European capitals, I think, are melting over many of these documents. They're sort of shocked but not surprised, given the approach the Trump administration has taken. I think what we see in capitals like Tokyo and Canberra is just really open questions about how the Pentagon is able to do 2 very different things at once. So much activity has focused on the Western Hemisphere. You've had a bunch of use of force instances in the Caribbean, the Venezuela operation, obviously as well. Because you've seen this decrease in posture in the Indo-Pacific, I think they're trying to figure out, to what extent do you maintain kind of technocratic mill-to-mill cooperation if fundamentally there are these different visions? And I'll just wrap by saying the section on the alliance with South Korea is sort of intriguing to me because it's a real cheerleader approach right? Look at how great your military is and you're spending so much money on your defense industrial base. You've got it. You don't really need us. And so we'll see the extent to which that becomes reality. I would look really hard at the extent to which we go down from 28.5 in a meaningful way. And if so, what kind of capabilities, assets, and platforms get taken out? And then do any more get put in across the region? Or once they're out of the Indo-Pacific, are they now kind of away?
Right. No, I think that's the critical question, right? In terms of, first, what's always been interesting to me is that it's actually cheaper to put U.S. forces in Korea than it is to base them at home, right? And second, this underscores the point, it's not directly relevant, but the South Koreans did build our largest overseas base, I think at a price tag of several $1 billion and paid between 96 to 98% of it, right? So it's not a bad deal for us, frankly. Don't say that during burden sharing negotiations, anyway, but
no, you're right. Well, and Mark, as you know so well, it's also actually a really big morale boost when you can go overseas in the military with your family, and have experiences there. So it is cheaper, and it actually is an experience a lot of folks want.
It is a very fair point. And to the last point I was going to make here, what is interesting is very unsung. The Trump administration did start changing the way troops are deployed to South Korea in a more coherent way, right? Which is pretty interesting, right? Pretty interesting in terms of trying to figure out these pieces. So, I think there's a deeper dive here on some of the pieces that have been in play, and it's not an uninteresting picture in terms of the long-term posture. So, but the proof is in the pudding still. Last question to you, Mara, quickly, and then over to Gordon. In terms of the Taiwan question, have you heard any reverberations about this, right? Which I find interesting because I think President Trump and Xi Jinping just had a phone call, and Xi Jinping did mention the Taiwan issue in the readout, but it's no mention of it rather in the NDS. So full stop there.
Yeah, that has absolutely been noticed across the board. This is not just something noticed inside Asia, to be clear. I would say globally, because it's just been so important, to U.S. national security interests, how one thinks about these kinds of issues. Before the Trump administration, there was a real effort to prioritize the challenge posed by China and to just increase its dilemmas, to make things seem a lot more complicated for it so that it would choose not to go after Taiwan or to go after any U.S. allies or partners in the region. And now, effectively, the declaration on First Island Chain and the real specificity, obviously, first of all, it excludes a whole bunch of folks, but it is curiously specific insofar as it ultimately, I think, constrains the questions in China's mind about where it should focus its energy and resources. And that's kind of the exact opposite of what you ever want to do when you are trying to cause problems and really make things complicated and difficult for a challenger.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Mara. Good stuff there. Gordon, over to you. Just anything you want to pick up on, obviously, number one. And number two, the one piece that I wanted to just explore with you is you've been covering this space, and largely the Trump administration 2.0 is focused a lot on trade and economics in the national security space, including in this document talking about one of the drivers for their Indo-Pacific posture is to keep access to what they called is the world's biggest market. How do you see these two pillars, I guess, of national security, foreign policy working in concert in this administration going forward?
I'll take that. One thing I just wanted to say, which is kind of stating the obvious, which we're all kind of on this, the edge of our seats here on what's going to happen in the Middle East, which just to kind of foot stomp, earlier points, is like the buildup inside the Middle East right now, goes right in the face of what this document's saying. We're going to reduce in Europe. We're going to reduce in the Middle East. We're going to, and then here we're seeing again a huge buildup, and we don't know what comes of these negotiations are happening, I think, tomorrow.
Right, and it underscores, just to give you a gold star here, it underscores what you're saying, in that it's the president who's making the decisions, and the document isn't really necessarily binding on the strategic direction. Sorry, just I wanted to amplify.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, all these documents and all these pronouncements have to keep up with what the president is saying and doing. And we've tried to, as reporters during Trump 2.0, we try to focus on what he's doing, but you can't ignore sometimes what he's saying. So anyway, just saying, like, and if something comes of the threat, certainly on Iran, that buildup is not going anywhere. Presumably, I don't think they can, Pottery Barn rule, completely break it and then not pay for it. So anyway, so that just as an aside, I don't know what I can say about the trade thing. I think the interesting thing that I think Pete Hegseth is trying to do, the Pentagon, is build up and boost the ability for the American defense industrial base to get things done and get things built. And this is honestly, like, Trumpism at its best in some ways is bringing common sense and knocking bureaucracy out of the way and, like, getting something done. And I think for years, covering the Pentagon, just kind of the space generally, there's been this kind of enduring frustration with how to build up, build more ships, build more Patriot systems, build, more missiles.
I mean, this comes back to, like, Bob Gates and the Humvees, right? Ash Carter took this on, and now we're back at the now we're now Hegseth is
hopefully building on those,
yes.
those earlier initiatives. But Gates is a perfect example of the MRAPs. Is he just busted through and said, we need these vehicles, we're going to do it. And so I'd love to see Hegseth, achieve some, success with doing this on this end. I think you were making a point, or somebody was making a point earlier, just, there's very little in this document about the Chinese industrial base and what, like, the thing that we've been fearing for a long time. They're able to do this, that, and the other thing so much faster and with a much more kind of bureaucratic ease because it's China. But you don't see a lot of deconstruction on that in this. In this document. But I do think, again, just to kind of like put a bow on it, is like, this is about non-confrontation, conciliatory talk in order for Trump to potentially create some legacy building relationship, trade, economic, even industrial-based relationship with China, with Beijing.
All right, outstanding. All right, thanks, Gordon. Good stuff there. And just maybe one go back from me. What's interesting is that it comes back to Mara's point. Obviously, there's an effort to supercharge the defense industrial base. Goes with this emphasis on economics and trade, by the way, which is interesting. But to Mara's point, what you build, right, matters in terms of how you view the threat, right? How you view the threat matters in terms of what you build. Sorry, I didn't have my coffee yet. I need an AUKUS mug. So anyway, I think that's important. All right, we're at the end. If we could just give everybody a minute here to final words. Sid, to you first. Final words on the show here.
I find Donald Trump's foreign policy is security policy is a combination of personal, political, and pragmatic. And I do believe that, when people say Donald Trump prefers peace, he prefers not to appear to be seeking war or destabilization or overthrowing governments, fighting ideologies, that there's a degree of truth to that. And so I think in that regard, though, in terms of his actions against Iran, both, the preemptive strike on nuclear facilities and the possibility of conflict today, he's proven a willingness to use force. And so I think this document and its ambiguities may actually be its strength to him, because it doesn't lock you into any course of action that, we invest heavy in Indo-Pacific, and China ends up not doing anything and all hell breaks loose somewhere else in the world. there'll be flexibility built into the documents and their actual implementation. It'll make it frustrating assessing their implications. We need to be, keeping our eyes focused on how it drives investments and developments going forward. But if I were anybody out there, in my case, a Korea guy looking for some more solid commitment to challenge the North Korea threat, there's no need to be disappointed. And I think we look at South Korea's response because they got many ways to talk with us, SCM, MCM, kid, the format. There's many ways to talk to us about, the Trump administration's views toward national security, our commitment to the Republic of Korea, that this document is not going to fundamentally undermine.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Sid. Yeah, I would say in terms of going up and down in troop levels, you say 1,000 or so, 28.5. I'd say it surges by 5,000 when the kid's underway. I'm joking.
Yeah,
all right, everybody likes that dialogue.
What will be interesting is if there's ever a point by which those 28.5 turn their mission and it fundamentally changes the nature of the troops that are deployed, then we'll know something's changing and different. Just verbally saying the troops on the peninsula need to be ready for a contingency with China, to me, is just common sense.
Right. Okay, outstanding. We'll leave it there. Mara, over to you.
Yeah, I think the words in the document, but above all, the actions of the administration over the last year have shown that threats posed by China and by North Korea, security threats specifically, aren't terribly high on the priority list. And so what I'm going to be looking for over these coming months is what sort of plan Bs do U.S. allies develop? Or do they do all they can to try to keep the United States in and to try to get it to really worry about those sorts of threats in a security manner?
All right, outstanding. I also was struck by the language about the Europeans needing to basically focus on their own theater, right, versus in previous administrations trying to get Europe more involved, which is interesting too. All right, excellent there. We'll leave it there, Mara. Gordon, last word to you.
I know that's such an honor. Again, I would say that I think it will be interesting to see if they execute on this strategy. President Donald Trump is not worried about some document that some politicals at the Pentagon, put together. But I think like what we saw with the Greenland, like where he essentially was able to off-ramp. Well, let me back up and say, I think there will be concerns from the Hill, from his own party and his allies, if they do anything if they cut into bone in South Korea, in Europe, and potentially even in the Middle East. And so what I think Trump is good at doing is creating a headline as an off-ramp to say, okay, we're going to do this. So you might see like some reductions. It would be really interesting to see. And in some cases, some of these are smart decisions. Like maybe we don't need 28.5, or maybe you need less, but like a different capability set or whatever. Same thing in these other theaters. And, I think we could see some changes potentially under the document. But again, if the president gets too much pushback and he's like, oh, we're going to rip, X thousand numbers out of any of these theaters, he can come up with a way to kind of off-ramp it, create the headline that he's kind of achieved his ends, and nobody's the wiser, really. But again, I don't think that he's going to be adhering too much to a strategy document because it's just not how he governs.
All right, outstanding. Gavel down on episode 128 of the CSIS Capital Cable. Thanks to Dr. Karlin. Thanks to Gordon Lubold. Thanks to Sid Seiler. And just to summarize, we've got a reprioritization, de-emphasis apparently on China, lots of flexibility for the president, especially the way the president governs. And the proof will be in the pudding. So watch the spaces of procurement, posture, personnel going forward. With that, only a couple months till the opening of KBO season. Go Doosan Bears. All right, see everybody in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.
See you later.